Good evening, everybody. I have a bunch of retrobates today that wouldn't go on mute, and Chris Martin, we could hear him singing and drinking, and yeah, and then they were commenting on people's beards and stuff. So, welcome to our fireside chat.
Beers.
This was supposed to happen in a physical space. I think it was in DC Thompson's office or Warricle's office about 10 weeks ago, when we all could have sat in the same room together. But COVID happened. Chris Newman had to fly out of the country pretty quickly. And we all said that we'd do this again online. And we've invited some more people to join us as well. So tonight we've got Chris Martin from Warricle. We've got Chris Newman all the way from the US. Paul Atkinson from Edinburgh, the blow-in. We've got David Farquhar. We've got Alistair as well, who has some connection to Dundee, but so we'll let him off as well. And I don't have any connection either. So I'm going to hand over to Chris Martin just to say a few words, and then over to Paul Atkinson.
Oh, you've caught me in the hop, Jude. I didn't expect to have to say that.
You're just going to say hello, and then you can do your bits then later.
Well, I'll do that. But yeah, this event, Jude's right, it should have been run in DC Thompson's. They'd allowed us to use their venue, so thank you for that, even though the event didn't go ahead. And Bright Solid were to be co-sponsors at that time, and thank you for that. But I'll hand on back to you.
Okay, and who do we say would go next?
Hi Jude, I'll go if you want. Thanks everyone for coming on the call, and thanks Chris. We're all virtually in Dundee this afternoon, and I do have some connection to Dundee, both my children in Dundee and my grandchildren in Dundee, so I can claim that connection. I don't have that much connection to Edinburgh either, really, when I live here. I'm actually from South Yorkshire, but which Chris Martin explained to me slightly earlier on, that the People's Republic of South Yorkshire is quite similar to the People's Republic of Dundee, so I'm sure we're all going to get on this afternoon. We've got a great lineup of speakers this afternoon. Obviously, Chris is going to come back on a bit later on. Alistair Forbes, who does have some connection to Dundee and has been a fantastic contributor to a lot of the webinars so far, and in particular has launched an initiative to deal with COVID called the Scottish Tech Army, which I'm sure he'll say something about. We've got David Farquhar, who's got a business in Dundee, IGS, which is a vertical farming business. I'm sure it's more than that. I'm sure David will explain that, and I think he's going to say a bit about that. But also, David's a really experienced VC and has raised money, a lot of money, both here and in the US, and I'm sure he'll say something about that. Chris is going to talk about winners and losers, and maybe impact on Dundee of the winners and losers. And then we've got Chris from Silicon Valley, who's going to give the Silicon Valley view of life. And then we'll have a bit of a Q&A and kick around the questions after that. So I think it's Alistair Forbes on first, Alistair. Maybe you could start off just by maybe a bit of an introduction, background, and then dip into what other cities have done in response to COVID. Over to you, Alistair.
Absolutely. Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everybody. So as was mentioned earlier, I'm not based in Dundee, but certainly have had connections with Dundee, and a business that Chris was involved in as well, which started off as Handdog Technology, which was an early cloud-based business starting in 2004. And we were fortunate enough to go on a great ride with that business, and built up what turned out to be a very international business, but still had strong roots in Dundee. The organization that acquired the business still has an office in Dundee. And so it's a SaaS business which was set up to deliver a cloud-based platform. And we were able to benefit from all the talent that exists in Dundee, and we were able to grow from that base and develop the business from there. I think to the point of this evening's conversation around ecosystems and the how you build communities, I think it's fair to say that Dundee had, at that point, a number of communities that were already fairly well established. So obviously, the gaming industry has been well established in Dundee for a long time, the life sciences industry as well, and it's not been as known for software and SaaS type businesses, but the pool of talent that exists in Dundee is a great opportunity to build businesses in the city. When it comes to developing communities and ecosystems, it's really interesting, I think, that this event was originally planned to be a physical event and has now turned into a virtual event. Because I think a lot of the communities that have been built have been very much geographically based historically. So if you look at the environment in Edinburgh, for example, as a tech centre that's emerged in the UK, I think there's been a lot of activity there, and I think there's certainly a huge amount of energy that's been created as a result of that. You can look into other cities. So obviously in the UK, London is very much a tech centre. And while I would say Edinburgh is a pretty vibrant tech scene, you know, I think London is an order of magnitude bigger in many regards, and it's more developed. But also looking internationally, you see a number of other centres springing up and developing those communities. And you look at Berlin, for example, has got a really active tech community. And obviously, if you go across the Atlantic into the US, lots of communities there. I mean, Chris, very much embedded in the California ecosystem. I actually don't know, Chris, if you've also been involved in some of the other tech centers around the US. So Boulder, for example, in Colorado is a really interesting example of how a tech community was built, so much so that Brad Feld, who's a former entrepreneur and now an investor, has written a book about it called Startup Communities, which is a really interesting read if you want to just get an insight into how the Boulder community developed. Obviously, the Valley that Chris, I'm sure, will talk about is a good example of that, but also there are other examples springing up around the US. So Boston has been a very active tech center, both in the software and the life sciences space, and Austin in Texas. So, you know, there are a number of these clusters that have sprung up. I think, you know, looking at certainly the environment in Scotland, it's interesting to reflect on how that has developed. And there's a balance to be struck between having sufficient volume of activity and not diluting the activities in such a way that you become subcritical. I think for Dundee in particular, you know, it'll be really interesting to see how this continues to develop there, and you know, what lessons can be learned from some of the other communities that have been created. Because I think if you look at certainly the Edinburgh ecosystem, I think there's in some instances, there's an excess of quantity over quality in some of the stuff that happens, to be fair. So I think in terms of developing communities, learning from those ecosystems and communities will be really important. But I come back to, you know, the point about the virtual nature of this meeting and of how community development is going to happen, because you know, Paul and Jude were kind enough to mention the project that I've been involved with over the last few weeks, the Scottish Tech Army, and we're not here to talk about that, but the only reflection I will make on that is that the speed at which that community has developed has been something I've never experienced before. And so it really reinforces to me the power of a unifying mission. So, you know, it's a very clear call to action for the community that we've created there. So it'll be 4 weeks old on Tuesday to come. And the speed at which that community has developed, the passion of the people who've got involved in it, has really been unlike anything I've ever experienced in business or any other project that I've been involved in. And that's all been done online, obviously. It's all been done using online tools, Slack, Zoom, those kind of things. And I'd be really interested to hear how the discussion goes today in terms of, I know the original idea was to talk about how the Dundee tech community will develop and will evolve. But you know, the extent to which the opportunity exists to tap into other communities that are already out there, to bring in people who've had some of those experiences, and to see what you can do that can accelerate the development of those kind of things. Because the pace at which you can do things, I think, you know, we've all kind of understood it, but we've really got to experience it a lot more in the last few weeks. So I mean, the SBRC and the work that Jude and Paul have been doing around that, there's a whole community that's built up around that in a matter of weeks. Same with the Scottish Tech Army, and there's lots of other communities that have just sprung up. So I think we really just need to have, in the course of the discussion today, some inputs and some insights into how that's going to happen in a different way going forward. So just some introductory thoughts there, and I'll pass back to you, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Yeah, well done on the Scottish Tech Army. It's a great initiative, and great to see the progress on that. Next up, we've got my old friend and contact, David Farker, who's got a fantastic business he's building out of the Dundee location. But David's also a really experienced venture capitalist and got lots of connections. I'm sure he's got some learnings in terms of the journey he's been through. Prior to this, prior to IGS, he was very much more in the kind of software and technology area. David, I'd like to pass over to you and your thoughts on where we are and where we're going.
Still muted,
David. David, you're on mute still.
Yeah, thank you. I see we have about 40 people here. I was asked originally to talk about, to back up some of the stuff that Chris is going to talk about. Chris Newman's going to talk about raising cash, particularly from American investors. So if it would be helpful, I've chucked together a few slides about what we did. I know this is a fireside chat, but it probably will bring it to life a wee bit more if I share some of that stuff. Do you want me to do that?
Yeah, sure, David, go ahead. That'd be great.
Okay. Can you see a slide?
I can.
Great. I'm going to get absolutely lambasted by anyone who knows IGS, because this is the old brand that we moved away from, but I didn't have time to do it in the new brand. So sorry, marketing people. So what I thought I'd start with is do this presentation kind of the wrong way around. Just to orientate you though, we started the business, or someone else started the business in 2013. I had actually retired. I'd sold my previous thing and I was just gardening. And I wasn't going to go back to work for anything ordinary. And this thing is quite extraordinary. And it's in an extraordinary market. So what I'm going to share with you was all the stuff that had sort of accumulated in my brain in the previous 25 years when I never thought I'd have to go back and raise money again, and how we managed to get 3 American VCs to the table. So I'll start with the ask. This was the last slide in our pitch. So we needed to put together, on the basis of our plan, around about 10 million. We were looking for about 7 in equity, about 3 in debt. And we were looking at a market that was massively growing with a growth rate of almost 25%. We ended up raising money to go to the end of the story, if you like, from 3 American VCs. So the most prolific agri-tech investor in the world is Seed to Growth, S2G Ventures in Chicago. They're backed by a major grocery family fund. We then got money from the second most active, Ag Funder. They're in Silicon Valley, founded though by an Australian guy. And finally, Osprey. Osprey is a multi-billion-dollar New York hedge fund, but they created a VC to invest in us, and they've now invested in 3 assets in the space. And good old Scottish Investment Bank, who came in to plug a gap and actually were really terrific. So the way that we kind of engaged these guys was very, very pragmatic. The first thing that we had was a huge opportunity. Everybody's got to eat. The employment levels in agriculture around the world are absolutely enormous. And some of the biggest problems in agriculture are caused by agriculture itself. So I'll show you a quick little video here, which I hope will come up. Are you seeing our browser now?
Yeah, that's fine, David. Yeah.
Right. So this is just a 90-second thing, which walks you through it. So this is Invergowrie. It's actually in Perth and Kinross, I'm afraid, not Dundee, but it's right on the ring road. And this is a 4-tower farm.
David, can I stop there? We can't see the video. It's
Oh,
Chris.
you can.
Right.
Okay. Let me go back. I think what I'm sharing is probably a specific thing, and I probably need to share my whole screen. Okay. Can you see something that says take the tour?
Yeah.
That looks better now.
Is that running?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the farm. This is Invergowrie. Each tower is about 42 square meters footprint. It grows crop at, for Michelin star quality, at 15 times the yield of the best greenhouse in the world. It has a 0 carbon footprint, no emissions, very low water and energy use. It's based upon every IKEA warehouse in the world, believe it or not, because our CTO has built every IKEA warehouse in the world. Each of the trays is the size of a snooker table, 6 square meters. They're 30 centimeters apart, but each one's its own microclimate, and they can be 6 degrees Celsius separate from each other, even though they're virtually touching. We've got the LEDs delivering the sunlight, and we've got HVAC delivering the wind on the bottom of each tray, and then the irrigation happens in the middle. So it's a pretty amazing piece of kit. It takes 50 partners to build one of these in our supply chain. So it's a fairly sort of complex proposition, but you can stick it literally anywhere from Riyadh to the Antarctic, and it will work. It's tested from minus to plus 60 Celsius. Hopefully you're now back to the slides.
Yeah.
Okay, so food, massive challenge. The second biggest cost or cause of the lack of arable land in the world is in fact agriculture itself and its emissions. And right now, agriculture is emitting more into climate change than transport is, for fairly obvious reasons. Massive issues of food waste, massive problems with the export and import of food across the world, and real difficulty in trying to change agriculture because most farms are absolutely tiny. So enormous problems. People have been trying to solve them with this kind of technology for ages. It's not very efficient. The biggest problems are labor cost and energy cost, although it varies depending upon where you are. And people have tried to design different sorts of vertical farms, most of which are absolutely nuts. So we've got a massive industry. It needs to be revolutionized. Now with COVID, it actually needs to be localized. So we were able to pitch this and to pitch a very pragmatic solution to part of world food problems to the most knowledgeable VCs in the world. So one of the things we found we needed to do was really give them a lot of stats, give them a lot of information about the size of the opportunity and the breadth of it across the world. We then needed to get very specific. So we looked at national food strategies in a couple of places around the world, and we compared what we could do on the right of this slide to what people were trying to achieve on the left of this slide. And we were able to say that we've already solved most of the problems. All the R&D that had been done in the 5 years before I took the business over. The other thing that was enormously important was to look at pricing. So if you look at the price for retail, wholesale, large production, and so on, I don't know if this is blocking the, yeah.
Yes, so, good, David, carry on.
Yeah, we are 1/10 of the price of wholesale in London, which means the margins available to our customers were enormous. So we discovered that when we were pitching American VCs, they were really, really data-driven, but they didn't have a lot of knowledge as to what's going on outside the USA. So delivering stuff like this and about the market in Singapore was very, very important in winning them over. Another thing we discovered we needed to do was make our business model incredibly simple. So what our business model said was, the only thing that IGS will do is specify, sell, and support systems and deliver our software in the cloud to our customers. Everything else in terms of manufacturing, shipping, assembly, support, will be done by third parties. And by focusing in that way, again, we were able to take some of the risk out of this investment for our investors. We were also very clear about our strategy. The most important piece on this slide is the bottom bullet point. So we've said to the market that we will never grow crop for commercial sale. That makes us unique. All the big brands in the world are trying to grow crop and invent their own technology, and they're actually making a hash of both of them. That's causing us a problem because people lose faith in the sector, but it is beginning to turn around. But that really, really important to have a very clear strategy like that. We were very clear with them about where we were positioned with regards to competition, so that they knew that we'd done our homework on that. And they had actually already done due diligence on almost everybody who was on this slide. So they were able to reference us against them. And again, that was really super important. Another thing they loved about this slide was we were telling them that this was a relatively de-risked investment, because we brought together a management team that knew what the journey was going to be like. I also said to them, you know, based upon the training I went through at the Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, no plan ever survives contact with the enemy. So whilst we gave them big spreadsheets, we gave them this roadmap, we told them, we know it's not going to be like that, but that's okay because we're prepared for it to have to change. And they loved that story as well. We were super clear about what we were going to spend money on with them. And we also had a second product line, and that's a thing that a lot of people shy away from. But our investors really liked this. So what you're looking at in the two photographs on the right-hand side is a version of our aluminium busbar system that drives a vertical farm, applied to be a supplementary lighting system in a polytunnel or a greenhouse. Marks and Spencers and Waitrose came up to look at this thing, and they said, could we put this into our stores? And so we've developed a version of it that will go into retail stores, car parks, hospitals, any commercial building. It's a completely different channel model. It's a completely different sales cycle. And actually they regard this as securitizing their investment because it's counter-cyclical to the vertical farm, which is a nascent business. So that's it. Those were the learnings from raising money from US VCs. And we got there, we raised our 7 million and we raised it on an absolutely fantastic valuation, even though we were pre-revenue. It was in the mid 20 millions.
Thanks, David. Well, I mean, what a massively superb local story. World-leading technology out of the locality. Just amazing. And good job from obviously from the founding team, and great job since David got involved. But I hope you're all taking notes, because there's quite a lot of good notes there in terms of how to pitch to get a good valuation on a business. And yeah, fantastic. So I think next up we've got Chris Martin, who's going to give a Dundee point in life view, but actually more importantly, he's got some great slides in terms of winners and losers going forward. Over to you, Chris.
Well, thanks, Paul. I didn't realise this was a fireside chat, so I prepared some slides, and it says 20 minutes of guff, or is it at the top? I'll try and cut that down to 10. And we'll only know if it's guff in about 3 or 4 years. So, you know, when we put this talk together, I suggested that somebody else do the futurology piece, but unfortunately I got landed with it, so I'll try my best. So firstly, terrible situation, but my job is to keep on keeping on, sort of grim bastard style. People talk about resilience. There's a new kid in town where they talk about anti-fragile, and that's about benefiting from disorder. I take it you can all hear me. So I spend a bit of time forecasting what the new world might look like. And that's really because I think I'm pretty lazy. I would rather be in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing, than be really good at something, because it's much, much easier to do good business when there's a line going like that. And also I'm minded just to recount a story. I used to play chess with my ex-girlfriend, and I'd be thinking 5 or 6 moves ahead, and she would take all my pawns and I couldn't win. So sometimes you can think too far in the distance, and it's about the here and now. And of course, everything's regional, and fear and confidence are contagious, and humans under stress will follow herds. So what you get in this kind of situation is things going back and forward at great rates and knots. And obviously, I'm looking at the world from a Dundee point of view. So in terms of assumptions, I'm thinking that there'll be social distancing through to middle of 21. It'll start to soften next month in Scotland, as we've seen. There'll be treatment advances through the rest of this year, which mean that if you have to go to hospital, there'll be improved outcomes. There may be a vaccine, probably next year, and it will take quite some time to vaccinate everybody or to achieve herd immunity. So I'm forecasting that this, on a large scale, will run on until next year, and that means big changes in the short term. And I think the important question is, of these short-term changes, what become normal? So I spend a lot of time thinking about the future, and that's in relation to our own business. Sorry, I forgot to talk about our business, but I'll come back to that. So my spreadsheet is enormous. It's got mega trends, the green agenda. It's got the sort of future forecasting of what the recession might do to the business. It's also got changes to particular industries, and technology changes are things like 5G that are coming in and how you might weave those in. So this is just one line of my spreadsheet there, and it's around aviation. So you see there what's happening now. Nobody wants to go on a plane. There's government imposed travel restrictions. The industry's taking a huge hit. Now I think in 6 months it might be a little bit better, but not much better as the airport gets a bit slicker. I think the situation in 2 years is we may have some sort of vaccine, but I don't think air travel will go anything like back to what it used to be. For lots of reasons, I think the aviation industry is going to be extremely difficult. So the green blobs there are who are going to win in the short term. So I think domestic tourism is going to win. I think outside tourist attractions are going to win. I think people will be attracted to lower density experiences, and businesses will reduce travel expenditure and do much more remotely. And then I look at who are the suppliers of the winners, and then I look at who are the suppliers of the suppliers of the winners, and then I look at who are the losers over the next 2 years, and the supply chain of them, and the suppliers of the suppliers. And so obviously airline manufacturers, Rolls-Royce, Boeing, etc., they're going to be impacted. International tourism is going to be impacted. Things like travel insurance are going to be impacted. Luggage manufacturers are going to be impacted. The universities here in this country are going to be impacted because of less foreign students. That has knock-on effects for some businesses in Scotland. Unfortunately, Skyscanner and Travel Nest will be impacted. The bars and the nightclubs in town centres will be impacted. Even down to luggage manufacturers will be impacted. And actually, I noticed an email from the Airbnb CEO down in the bottom left of the corner there, and that was an email he went out when he was reducing the size of the company, I think a couple of weeks ago, by 25%. And he says himself, travel in this new world will look differently. People will want options that are closer to home, safer, and more affordable. And I think that kind of backs up what we feel. And actually, if you ever have to let anybody go, that email is a really good email to look at. It sets out how you ought to be looking at restructuring your business with a bit of heart. So in a sort of Dundee sense, the little blue square at the end, and bear in mind this is only one industry, there is lots of industries. So golf businesses are going to be really impacted in St Andrews. That's going to be really difficult for them. The universities are going to come under financial pressure as international students are less inclined to come to Scotland. That's going to have a knock-on effect on oil and gas, and so it's an handy thing to think about. I looked at the air aviation market, and only 12% of air passengers are business, but that accounts for about 75% of revenue. And then I thought about Loganair and Dundee. I suspect they're even more exposed to business travel than the norm there. So I put these all together, I've rolled these all up, and I think these are the businesses that may prosper as a result of COVID. Healthcare and wellness, there'll be a great renewal and a speed up of investment there. Green energy, health equipment, we must manufacture our own health equipment. As food, as David said, there's a bit of a deglobalization agenda on there. We have to be able to manufacture these things in our own country. Domestic tourism, remote working, Micromobility is an interesting thing. You know, electric bikes and scooters, the last mile commute into the town. I think pre-staging physical transactions, click and collect will win. Electronic payments are going to boom. The delivery economy is going to boom. Online education is going to boom. And all of this is really sort of underpinned by digitization, digital transformation on the cloud. And obviously gaming and films for consuming at home will boom. And I think something which is interesting to think about is, I think that the value of land on the edge or out of town will rise relative to value of land in the centre of town. And I put a wee graphic in there, which I did myself, and Sharon, our marketing director, is on the call, and she'll be wincing at my graphic design there. But I think safety outranks work and leisure now, and that seesaw tipping up really quickly has the effect of pulling up all sorts of remote work and digitization, online stuff, delivery economy. And luckily for Warwickle, I think a lot of that will be done through your phone. So into the headwinds, you know, commercial property is going to come under real pressure. Universities and colleges, I think we've already talked about. Commuting, difficult international travel, oil and gas, paper and cash usage, I think, has dropped through the floor in most countries, not all of them. Paper documents can no longer flow around highly distributed organisations. Signatures are difficult. Town centres will be impacted, and I think the value of land in town centre may come down a little bit. And so in summary, I think that people dense situations will lose, people will move less, data will move around more, and things will be delivered to you. And touching public things will become a difficult, you know, people don't want to do that. So there's lots of things that are squished down by this seesaw of safety, dense experiences moving around and touching public things. So I think COVID changes the mentality in talent management and talent acquisition. It's obviously very difficult to work at home. You'll see that picture of me squashing my little kid's face. That's what you want to do to them when they interrupt you for the 100th time when you're trying to do something. But people used to think home area first. But with this new environment, remote working, it's much less of an anchor than it used to be. And the talent winners will be companies, and Alistair picked up on this, the companies that are offering the best purpose for the work they do. You know, that's going to become massively important. Obviously, it's going to have an interesting effect on I think, salaries. As Chris Newman talked about earlier on, Facebook and Twitter will be recruiting remotely, and you know, and that means that people in Dundee can go and work for the big brands. And an interesting thing about, there are companies that are completely hybrid at the moment. For example, DuckDuckGo, that have been doing this hybrid working thing for a long time, and they've got a demonstrably great culture. And I suspect that people like that have got a great hybrid culture will win. And similarly, it affects the universities, because we're going to delay. Lots of students will delay starting, and that has a delay starting next year, and that has a knock-on effect of 4 years of reduced revenue for the universities. And the competitive dynamic for students changes. People can, in theory, attend more distant universities. So I think a thing that I think about in marketing is generally, in a sort of digitized sense, the short tail wins. That's to say the big brands win. So in the war for talent, I suspect the big brands might fare quite well out of this remote workforce relative to the small brands. Now, I've spent a long time sort of moaning around Dundee about trying to get Dundee University and Abertay to, you know, to create more software engineers, and you know, and I've got a whole talent map down there, which is in the bottom right of the screen, and I think that somebody in Dundee, this is going to become a big issue, and somebody in Dundee needs to start coordinating this and, you know, helping the businesses which could do great things, do great things. So, you know, just for a wider Dundee sense, there is going to be a rise in digital. You know, digital is going to be a bigger thing than it was. People are less constrained by geography now, and that could be both a benefit to Dundee and a loss. You know, I'm always going to call for Dundee Uni and educational people to step up and start creating more software engineers and more adjacent skills. There will be a boom in healthcare, which is obviously important in Dundee already. But possibly less commuters, shoppers, drinkers, office workers in the town centre. Oil and gas is going to become difficult, but decommissioning and green energy will rise. And I think that's very important to just in the round, the knowledge economy will prosper, and it's not necessarily based on physical things. And that's my little girl there. And I just want to share a story. As a sort of newly middle-aged guy, I was lying on the bed a couple of years ago with a pair of specs on, and she walked into the room and she looked at me and she said, "Haha, nerd." And I said to her, "But the nerds have got all the money." And I think that's an important thing. You know, somehow we have to make it cool to be a nerd, to be in STEM for the little kids that currently want to be singers and footballers and all that kind of stuff. And I really, really think that we need to have a massive revolution on teaching digital in the schools. What we've got at the moment just isn't good enough. There's a boom, you know, a boom in digital skills, and the amount of people that are studying digital in secondary school is actually going down. And so somebody needs to seize control of that and get fixing that frontal. And I think I'll just skip over that slide. Really, other than that, what I will say is obviously there's everybody that's in the front line, bravely doing their work. But there's lots of unsung heroes in tech that have kept the world going, because if the IT people and the coders and the comms engineers and the DevOps people hadn't done their work this year and the year before and the year before, there wouldn't be an economy to even save at the moment. We'd all be really struggling. And I think that's enough for me.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Fantastic presentation and tons of information as usual. I hope everyone on the call was taking loads of notes on what's going to win in the future. And indeed, it's great to see another example of a business that's doing so well out of the locality, and some challenges there in terms of skills. In particular on the skills, I think Chris is absolutely right. The global brands going forward are going to recruit from anywhere. So you could sit in Dundee and work for Facebook, no doubt. Although I think Chris Newman's going to come on to tell us how that's maybe a bit false and how some of the other brands might win more. So next up, we've got Chris from across the pond in Silicon Valley. Chris, what's going to happen next? Come on, tell us what's going to happen next.
Let me pull out my my crystal ball and tell you all the answers. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I was very much looking forward to the original version of this chat. I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I think teaching STEM, encouraging people to get into STEM, mathematics, those types of topics earlier on is hugely important. My background, ironically, my toddler picks my go-to-work background every day. And for those who don't know, this is a television show from the US called The Helpsters, which is created by the same folks who do Sesame Street. And it actually teaches toddlers the thinking skills that are a precursor to learning how to program. So it's a great way to get 3-, 4-, and 5-year-olds to start thinking about those sorts of things. A lot of names I've also heard that are very familiar to me. Alistair was talking about Brad Feld. My last company, Data Hero, Brad was actually an investor in. And so the interesting thing about the Boulder community is Boulder is a very small city, sort of in the middle of America, not really near anything else. And a few guys, Brad, David Cohen, Ryan McIntyre, and whatnot, decided for lifestyle reasons, 15 years ago, they were going to relocate to Boulder. And they've effectively been doing what VCs are talking about today as revolutionary for the better part of a decade and a half, which is investing in founders without actually meeting them. So when I raised a seed round for Data Hero in 2011, I had only met one of the 4 partners at Foundry. The rest of it was, it wasn't Zoom back then, it was probably Google Hangouts or something like that. But we are seeing a lot of global activity going on. The organization, quick background on myself for the benefit of everyone, former entrepreneur, was in the big data space for about a dozen years. Then I joined a global venture firm called 500 Startups and led their investing in AI, machine learning, and data related companies, and also ran an accelerator in San Francisco where we predominantly invested in international companies, brought them to the Bay Area, and taught them some of the things that, by virtue of the density of experience there, you really kind of have to go to the Valley to do. After that, I started the organization I run right now, which is called Commonwealth Ventures, which was actually built on the idea, hey, how can we help amazing companies tap into the experience that's sort of unfairly contained within the Silicon Valley without having to move there? And so for the last couple of years, we've been working with government organizations, corporates, and others, predominantly in Commonwealth countries. Canada and the UK are very similar in terms of their ecosystems, to help support founders there. So we've done a lot of work with the Data Lab, with University of Edinburgh. We are a large partner of Barclays. We run all of their San Francisco-based programming when they bring UK startups over the valley. Ironically, we actually last year brought a group of UK ag tech startups, and we had the founders of Ag Funder, who David mentioned, as speakers to the group we brought over. So on the one hand, a lot of this stuff is sort of incremental. This notion that we can have amazing tech ecosystems outside of the Silicon Valley and outside of the United States, I think we sort of frankly reached consensus on that even before this whole COVID thing. In some ways, this will accelerate a little bit of that. The counterpoint to that is I actually personally believe that some of the prophecies about the entire global workforce changing and everything being work from home are vastly overblown. The Canadian government a few weeks ago put out their principles of how to work during the COVID-19 situation. And the first principle they had is, you are not working from home. You are at home during a pandemic trying to work. Right. And these are very, very different things. As anyone who has kids can tell you, this is not work from home. We're also starting to see a lot of data coming out that the majority of people don't actually want to work from home. So, within weeks of this, there were all sorts of folks in tech, mostly white male programmers, saying, I'm going to move my entire company remote. We're never going to have an office again. This is amazing. This is the future. And then a lot of people going, I kind of like socializing. For a lot of people, they like the people they work with. They enjoy going to work and interacting with those people. And the data we're starting to see is in the neighborhood of 70–75% of people are saying, nah, this is not working for me. So I think we're going to actually end up somewhere with hybrid models. One of the things that has been sort of common practice in the Silicon Valley for about 10 years now has been an on-off day type of model, which is, okay, one day in the office, one day work from home, one day in the office, one day work from home. I expect to see a lot of that coming. I also expect that the announcements that were referenced about some of the big tech companies saying, hey, we're going work from home first, right? In the last week, we've seen announcements from Twitter and Square, both have the same CEO, not a surprise. Shopify in Canada, Facebook in the Silicon Valley saying, look, we're going to move to different types of work from home cultures. Part of that is going to be for recruiting. Part of that's going to be to save money on real estate. Part of that's, frankly, probably a precursor to some force reductions. But I suspect that the most competitive companies are still going to have a fairly significant in-presence base. We've seen relatively few companies succeed entirely remote, and probably the one that comes to mind as having in recent memory sort of started out that way was GitHub, which was an entirely remote company for many years. And they reached a point where they had to have in-person offices because they weren't able to actually scale at the rate they do. And so I suspect we'll see a big swing in terms of everyone saying work from home, work from home, work from home, and then people pretty quickly going, it turns out there's a lot of efficiencies being together. But it'll probably be different from what we see today in some sort of model. And I think I would also temper a little bit of the expectations about being able to work for large companies remotely. The reason being that within the scope of remote work, the companies that have done that, we've already seen a lot of data around the importance of time zones. Right. And so this was one of when people started doing offshoring and saying, hey, we're going to have a big office in India or Asia or Eastern Europe or whatnot. We quickly realized that actually having a meaningful time zone displacement from the core staff genuinely causes problems. And so I suspect you're only going to see folks like, a large Silicon Valley office hiring remote people within the same time zone or slightly adjacent time zone from where they have sort of a physical core, right? So, I think Facebook, for example, has an office in London. So it makes sense that somebody would work, in Dundee. out of the London office. But if Facebook's only presence was in Silicon Valley, I would highly doubt that in the short term you're suddenly going to see them hiring individuals that are a 8-9 hour time zone difference away just for logistical purposes. That's sort of my crystal ball for now. I think we're probably going to be. I agree with the earlier comments about how long this is going to last. We're expecting in the Valley, and most of the people who are much smarter than I are pontificating about this at least lasting into 2021 in some strange format. Fingers crossed that we don't have a massive resurgence. But I think we're starting to see the global economies open up, and some really interesting impacts of that to work. And I think I'll sort of pause it there and throw it back.
Thanks, Chris. Well, a great, or in fact, an amazing amount of content there. I hope you're all taking notes. I guess I want to kick off with, lockdown happened so suddenly for everybody. And one day you're in the office, the next day you're not, and then everyone's wondering who's going to fall over. I think for some companies, in the technology sector, triaging most of Scotland's technology companies, they're kind of coming through in reasonable shape, particularly if they've reduced costs and extended a runway. But some sectors went literally to zero revenue overnight, which is incredible and unheard of, so unprecedented. But always thinking about how best not to waste a good crisis to make changes to a business. What will we keep and what will we lose out there? What are the good things that have come out of the current crisis, and what would we keep, and what things would leave behind? So that's my kind of first question, and probably I'll maybe kick off and go back to our first speaker, Alistair Forbes, on this. What would you keep and what wouldn't you keep from the crisis, Alistair?
Sure. So I think interesting Chris's comments about. I think there was very much a kind of wave of, well, of course it's all going to be all remote now. And I don't think that's true. Company that I work with over in Canada, the CEO was saying, well, we don't need offices. And then one of his team was saying, well, that's because he doesn't like people much. So I think you're right, Chris, that actually, it's not going to be as extreme as people thought. But I think there will be a lot more flexibility. And I think, again, this idea of a mixed work pattern will become much more prevalent, and I think that's a good thing, because the idea of 2 or 3 days in the office and 2 or 3 days working from home gives people a lot more flexibility. There's environmental impacts of that as well. I think if you look at the pictures of cities around the world and the air quality differences that you've seen, it's hard not to be kind of struck by that. So I think that will certainly have an impact. I think, interestingly, in terms of sales activities, there's always, I think it differs between the UK and the US. I think the US is much more accustomed to the idea of doing remote selling just because of the distances involved. I think in the UK, there was still more of an expectation that, well, you're only an hour away, you can just come and have a meeting in the office with me to discuss this. So I think we'll see, certainly in the UK, much greater acceptance of remote selling, and the less of a need to go and have physical meetings with people when you're doing sales. I think the working patterns, again, just picking up on what you were saying, Chris, about the time zone differences. Obviously in the UK we don't have that, but in our company we ended up with offices spread across a very wide variety of time zones, from California to Adelaide. And so that is a big dislocating factor. I think that only really works effectively if you have got teams that can work relatively independently. So they've each got their own work products, and they need to coordinate them, but they're not all necessarily working on the same thing. I think one of the other things that's come out of the move towards more remote working is the fact that because you don't have that proximity, and this is something that the GitLab team have written a lot about, is that it does force you to write stuff down more. Some companies have been more inclined that way anyway. So although Amazon was largely an on-premise type of company, their culture is that people write stuff and they share documents rather than just getting in a room and talking about things. So I think those are things that are going to change. So I think there will be some beneficial effects that come out of it. I agree with Chris. I think I don't envisage, and I wouldn't really want to see that, you know, right, we're all going to live in the hills and nobody's ever going to go and meet with each other ever again. Because I think the task focused things that people can do remotely, you can be more productive doing that working from home. I think the creative things and the interaction things and, you know, the ideation is a lot harder to do. I think it'll be really interesting to learn a bit more about that. So we had somebody who gave a presentation to some of the folks in the Tech Army group about doing design sprints in a remote and facilitated way, and we're planning to set some of those up. So I think there's a lot to learn about how you can do those more creative and ideation type things that we haven't learned yet. So, you know, I think those are some of the things that I would see coming out of this as we go forward.
Thanks, Alistair. Some good thoughts there. And I was kind of mindful when I was listening to David's presentation earlier on about the change in supply chains, and maybe that's a kick-off point, David. What would you lose and what would you keep in terms of supply chains? And I guess coming off the back of Alistair's questions, the kind of working from home versus working in the office, the hybrid equation.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that's happened to us is we went from 8 people to 45 people from September last year to now, or to March. And halfway through that period at the end of the year on our quarterly all hands, one of the best bits of feedback we had was about the fact that we already allowed people to decide certainly where and quite often when they would work. So we have the farm at Invergowrie, we have an office in the middle of Edinburgh, and we have then people in about 8 other countries, either singly or in a small office. And for us, the transition to working from home has therefore been super, super easy. You know, that not every company can set up in that way. I think the part of our business that has struggled the most with it is the R&D effort up at Invergowrie. So everyone else is now obviously working from home. We have 4 people on furlough. And the guys at Invergowrie travel there from Edinburgh or Perth or Dundee, and they work in shifts of 2, where they have mutually sort of agreed that they are clean and all that kind of stuff, and they stay 2 meters apart. So as a working practice, that's been fine. We've even had people coming from food banks in Dundee, and we're giving away the crops that we grow. Because, I mean, we normally just take them home and eat them ourselves or compost them, but right now that seems a real waste. So we've been, for 2 weeks now, we've been donating crops to food banks and charities and things. So all of that's fine, and that's a tiny bit of supply chain. The challenge we've got is that COVID-19 has increased the size of our pipeline by about 300%. So governments around the world, farmers, operators, and so on, everyone is moving away from a globalization model to a localization model. So rather than importing a punnet of blueberries from Peru, why don't we just grow them in Dundee, you know, because we can now do that. And that's caused a real challenge in our supply chain, which I think I said earlier had about 50 people in it. We're having to appoint subcontractors in country, in different countries, and we're going to have to try to find a way to manage them remotely. So we're now looking at creating digital twins, which is a thing I had never heard of before, but it's a thing in the construction industry where you build a building, you use a building information management system, or something like Microsoft HoloLens, and you actually film the construction, and you then film the operation of the system, and you create a literal digital twin of a physical asset, so that you can train, so that you can show people how to construct things. So those have been real challenges.
Excellent. I mean, really amazing. That kind of move from globalization to localization, I think, is probably an unexpected future megatrend driven by the impact of this, which is absolutely fascinating. And Chris, we talked about winners and losers earlier on. what would you throw away and what would you keep about the challenge?
A good question. I mean, I echo what Alistair and Chris have said. I don't think it will go 100% to remote working because people have a biological need to socialise and they like it. I think that Alistair's right. I mean, for us, it was relatively painless for us to change over to a remote company. In fact, we did it before lockdown. And the things that were difficult are, as Alistair said, remote selling. You know, we realised we needed to take a different approach to selling. And also, and somebody talked about it, you know, this asynchronous working where you've actually got to write things down or leave them in a state where the next person can pick them up. You need to think much more about that. And, you know, and that was an important lesson for us. And the other thing which I think that has become important for me over the last 2 or 3 weeks is people that are living in their house on their own, often quite isolated, you know, their energy levels start to deplete. And so you need to make a much greater effort to keep people's energy levels around. So, you know, we've changed some tasks which were previously more solo tasks and turned them into swarming tasks. So people are sort of polluting each other with energy to keep things going forward at a clip, because it's tough to keep that momentum up in this environment, I think. So, I mean, what I would keep is flexible working. It's good, but it's not going to be everything.
Excellent. And well, I think finally we should kind of move across the pond to Silicon Valley, where everyone looks to the future. Chris, I'm sure you're going to excite us all about the future, but what would you keep and what would you lose about the changing environment?
There we go. To echo what's been said, I think the flexible work, as I alluded to, is something we had generally accepted in the Bay Area, at least within tech companies, right? And I think what you're going to see now is companies that are unwilling to be flexible, right? So in the Valley, at least, the common sense approach to flexibility was based on mostly 2 principles. Number one is, hey, people are more efficient if we're able to batch meetings into certain days, right? So Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we have meetings. Tuesday and Thursday is individual productivity. Okay, well, if Tuesday and Thursday are about individual productivity, you can do that from home, right? And the second was to get away from the nickel and diming on time off, right? Okay, I've got to stay at home because my kid has the flu, but suddenly I have to dip into my sick pay and some of this nonsense, which is just like, you know, really not very worker friendly. I think the companies that are unwilling to adapt to that norm, the common sense and sort of the trust model that, hey, yeah, maybe there's a bad apple every once in a while, but if you build a supportive culture where people are judged based on their work output and you empower them with the flexibility to do that, you're going to succeed. You're going to see a big gap between companies once people have the option to either, you know, work at the company that allows me to work from home if I need to, or if my kid doesn't have school this day or whatever the case may be, versus the company that insists, no, you have to physically be in the office 5 days a week and hit this punch card and, you know, be in this many meetings. So I think the notion of just face time as a management technique is going to massively reduce in importance in the next little while. You know, what would I get rid of? I certainly can't wait to get back on planes and go travel. I think to the conversation on sales, it's going to be really fascinating to see where that lands, right? Because so much of sales at the enterprise and the large check amount are in person, the relationship building. And so although the US is on one hand, yeah, remote selling is a thing, we're still more used to getting on planes than most folks in Europe. So, you know, for me, I'm used to flying an hour and a half for a 1-hour sales meeting and then flying back, right? So, you know, it'll be interesting to see where that lands. I don't know exactly where that's going to land at all. Yeah, and I think the whole globalization thing, that's gonna stick, right? I mean, you know, we saw that most prevalently with safety equipment and the global battles to see who could call dibs on face masks from China, right? I think there's going to be a lot of base items, food, safety, things that broadly fall under national security that will be, more nationalized in the future. I think we're also going to see a little more about the logistics piece, right? So at least, you think of a company like Amazon, right? Amazon's become fairly prevalent as an e-retailer in a lot of countries now. But if they're based in the US and they're focused on, delivering to their customers there, and you're suddenly seeing delays in ordering times in other countries, what does that do to the potential for more local or regional e-tailers? What does that do for the opportunity for postal systems that have potentially been underfunded in some places? Do they become more important as you have people working from home, or do you see them forced to modernize? Right? Do you see, competitors come up in those regards? So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities as a result of this. I don't know that they're all clear. I think there's a lot of folks making bets on sort of what'll turn out to be temporary shifts rather than permanent shifts. But there's a lot of things that are going to change, and it'll be interesting to see what happens. But personally, I just want to go to a bar and get a beer.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think I love the idea of, I think one of the messages from all the conversations tonight is there's still amazing opportunities out there. They're always changing, but maybe not as fast in some areas as in others. I love the concept of not nickel and diming the trust model in terms of the employees that are working for businesses. And I think that comes down to a combination of hiring to the right company values and running a business with a purpose. And then that becomes a lot more straightforward. Listen, we've had a great, I'm conscious of time, we've had a great set of discussions, presentations, questions, some great input. First, I'd like to thank all of the contributors this evening for amazing input. And thanks everyone for coming along. And there's
a question there, Paul, to follow on from.
Oh yes, do you want to ask the question? Go on.
It's from Graham Gordon, and it says, thanks for the information and presentation. Yesterday, he said there has been talk about a 4-day week, and myself and yourself were discussing this morning, Paul. The First Minister said how we look at things differently for the working week in Scotland. So how do the panel think, what do they think about the 4-day week work, and do people think it's going to be 4 days across 5 or expanded out of the 4 days across 7? Or any views on it?
Yeah, who wants to pick that up? I've got a view of it, but who wants to pick that up? Should we have an opinion from either side of the pond?
Yeah.
Who wants to go? Chris, Martin, you look like leaning forward. Looks like you've got an answer there.
I would like it to be a 4-day week, but I suspect it will be quite difficult, and it'll take some time to get to that.
Chris, from across the pond, what do you think?
When I hear proposals like that, it ultimately boils down to me: do you want a competitive economy or not? You look at countries like France and Germany, which in many regards are not competitive because they have such stringent rules about when workers can do things. On the other hand, hey, wouldn't everybody like a 3-day weekend every day or every week? Sure. So, I'm not a huge fan of imposing those things, but if companies want to do that as a means, look, if you can get your work done in 9 days out of 10, more power to you.
Yeah. David?
As I said earlier, I mean, we are super flexible. I think we have lost maybe 20% productivity, but we have, I think we have managed to keep, by keeping the team together in an environment like this, I think we've actually potentially strengthened our culture, because if you can get through this and still be at least 80% productive, I think that builds confidence in the team.
Yeah, I agree. Alistair, final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because I think, you think about all the stuff we've talked about during the course of this conversation. I think defining it as a 4-day week is becoming anachronistic. The idea that, there's this rigid divide. We're talking all about flexible working. The idea that, you'll work for 4 days and you won't work for 3 days, I think actually is becoming a less relevant concept. I think it comes back, there's a couple of comments there about the culture in the company. And again, just reflecting on what we've experienced in the last few weeks with the Tech Army cohort. If people are really bought into something, they want to contribute, they want to move things forward. And, we don't employ anybody, they're all volunteers. And we put stuff out on Slack at all times of the day and night. Within 10 minutes, there's 5 or 6 people all over it saying, yep, I'm in, I want to do this. So, they're not employed, there's no contract with them, they just want to do this. So if you get people really bought into something, the power of that is unbelievable. And, I shared an update with the team today on video to say, for me, it's always been a thing to aspire to, that people will think about the places that they work as one of the best places they've ever worked, and where they can do the best work of their lives. And if you get that culture into an organization, actually counting hours just stops. People contribute when they can, they're impassioned about what they're doing. So I think, talk about a 4-day week, and it's interesting your comments, Chris, about it's almost the case in some countries already, but it doesn't necessarily make things more productive or better. I think it's this whole thing about flexible working is about what you do while you are working and how motivated you are to do it. Much less than about the hours or even the place.
Yeah, I think I've got completely coincide with these views that it is the concept of a 4-day working week is anachronistic, particularly when you go to hybrid working models and so on, which Chris from over the pond was talking about, and actually a government deciding that we work for 4 days a week is kind of big government thinking and nanny state stuff, isn't it? As opposed to let people decide what's best for them, and let's provide a flexible framework when people can work how many days a week they want to work. And to Alistair's point, having people engaged to the right value set and the right outcomes, and avoiding that you have to be at your desk to be working. To me, that's anachronistic as well. We're probably a bit out of time, and again, I do thank everyone for coming along. There's probably a ton of questions unanswered, but maybe I can just pass back to Jude just to say a few final words, Jude.
David's been very, very busy answering all the questions there, so that's really good. Just to say thank you very much, and if anybody's got any ideas on what other fireside chats and stuff like that they'd like to see, just come back to us. And great to see everybody in Dundee out in force today, so you make Chris Martin very proud.
Excellent. Thanks,
okay.
Everybody. Thanks, Chris Newman. Thanks, Chris Martin. Thanks, David Farker. Thanks, Alistair Forbes. And thanks, Jude McCorry.
Thank you. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Have a good weekend.
Stay safe.
Yes.
Hi, everyone.